You know what? I'm not gonna do it this time. Let's just go ahead and do the review. Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Eugene Reviews. I am Eugene, and of course, if you're coming from The Last of Us Part 1 review, you obviously know from the title what today's video is going to be. This is going to be The Last of Us Part 2 video game review. Yes, today I decided I'm not just gonna do one video this week. This week was too big for it to just be one video. I gotta do both The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 because it would just pain me to put out a Last of Us Part 1 review and not dive in already to Part 2. So after 7 years of anticipation, The Last of Us Part 2 came out on June 19th, 2020. And I actually picked this up, or matter of fact, it arrived, was delivered to me on the 21st, on Father's Day, actually. So as soon as the Father's Day celebration and festivities were concluded, I immediately went home and I played The Last of Us Part 2. And this took me about a week, 7 to 10 days to finish it. And yeah, I couldn't wait any longer to get this out. Before we continue any further, once again, these are going to contain heavy spoilers, so you have been warned. Please, if you haven't played neither Part 1 or Part 2, which I'm about to review, I urge you, I implore you, pause this right now, play the rest of the video game, come back to this, and we can go from there, because we're going to dive into this pretty extensively. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into The Last of Us Part 2. Act 1, Development. The Last of Us... Wait a minute. There we go. Act 1, Development. The Last of Us Part 2, Take 1. So once again, after the release of The Last of Us, immediately after all of the critical acclaim and accolades that they were awarded, they went straight into production for The Last of Us Part 2. Development started as early as 2014, which was the time, or around the time, The Last of Us Part 1 was remastered for PlayStation 4. If I recall, in the history of Naughty Dog, this is the longest duration of development ever for a video game. After a couple previews were dropped, kind of teasing the continuation of the stories of Joel and Ellie, the game was announced for next-gen consoles for PlayStation 4 around 2018, 2019, I want to say. Maybe even earlier than that, with no official date. And then about mid-2019, we get the announcement from a new trailer that the game was going to be released on February 21st, 2020. Now, whether you want to say it was the rush development or they had to redo a couple graphics and a couple of gameplay twerks or whatnot, or you can even say, in the midst of this pandemic that we are currently going through, this whole COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic that the world is currently suffering, there were delays in the process, and from that, the date was pushed back from February to June. A couple little tidbits to recognize during the development and process of The Last of Us Part 2. Bruce Straley, who you remember was the co-director of The Last of Us Part 1 with Neil Druckmann, left Naughty Dog in 2017. Supposedly, there were reports from anonymous employees that the entire development of The Last of Us Part 2 endured high levels of crunch, as well as an overworking, overtiring schedule. When word got out about it, they were hoping this would be an ending of the culture of overworking and of just the tireless labor that was put into making this video game. The hope was this was going to end a culture of an overworking process in regards to video game making or any type of development in general. And then, of course, one of the big bombshells that dropped during the development of this game was the leak that occurred maybe about 6 months prior to the release of The Last of Us Part 2. Now, supposedly a big chunkage of the plot, a big chunkage of the story was leaked out to the public from an anonymous source, and that kind of left a little bit of a damp on not only the anticipation of the video game, but I believe the overall impression of what to expect for this video game. But it looks like despite all of the setbacks, despite all of the development hell, despite all of the delays, despite all of the leaks, it looked like in spite of that, the release for this game was still hyped to be one of the biggest video games of the year. And who could really deny the hype behind it? The gravitas from the first video game, the previews, the graphics, just the real life texture and structure that was showcased in these previews for The Last of Us Part 2. So the hype is there, the anticipation is there, the eagerness to play is there. I know for sure myself I was ready for this game, and yeah, no matter how much leaked, no matter how much you heard from the stories of the development, people were still ready to see the continuation of the story with Joel and Ellie. Now let's get into the execution of it. Yeah, we're gonna get into that. Act 2, Execution. The Last of Us Part 2, Take 1. All right, now it's time for the main course. Now we dive into the meat, the brunt of it all. The overall execution of The Last of Us Part 2. Let's start off easy. Aesthetically, to the naked eye, I have not seen a more beautifully crafted video game before and may never see one after. But who knows? PlayStation 5 is just around the corner. There could be some great games after. But as of this recording, I can say with a confident heart, I have not seen a more beautifully crafted and beautifully showcased video game in regards to CGI, in regards to the effects, in regards to just the overall look to it than I did with The Last of Us Part 2. Head to toe, top to bottom, left to right, all around, this video game looks so beautiful. It looks so magnificent. And what was just as good as the graphics, I believe, was the heightened improvement in gameplay. There were so many little tidbits throughout the video game in regards to gameplay that I found fascinating. You can go from the stealth mode in regards to crawling in the video game, from the way the wind blew and rustled the leaves and plants all throughout the video game, to the slightest shadow in the video game. There's really no words to express just the illustrious art that was displayed in this video game. And now let's go into what seems to be the divisive nature of this video game, the story. Remember, heavy spoiler alerts are coming. You've been warned for the final time. So, not even a third into the game, Joel is killed. And I will admit, as one that followed that character for the past few months, but for other 7 years, 6-7 years, it really is a bitter pill to swallow to realize that your main character was killed off. I understand both sides of the situation. Yes, this is an important character, and killing them off really kind of laid this hollowed and empty burden and void that was felt throughout the game. I also understand it should have been kind of anticipated from the artwork, from the trailers, from everything that we've seen. Either we should have known that Joel was gonna die from the lack of showcase of him, or they were kind of teasing us in that we were gonna see Joel, but they didn't want to show a lot. But it was the former that was the highlight of it. We see our beloved Joel being beaten to death by this new character known as Abby. Abby has a story herself. Abby is the daughter of the doctor who was in charge of the operation that was going to extract the blood and the infected part of Ellie's brain in order to create a cure. Case in point, her father was the doctor that was almost going to kill Ellie in the first game. But we all know what happened in the first game. Joel kills the doctor, saves Ellie, and the rest is history. A lot of this game has you playing the role of Abby, seeing her side of the story, seeing her perspective. So you follow her the moment before her father was killed, you follow her during her entire process of trying to get into the Fireflies, and you really see just her side of the story. To a point too where it kind of felt like was a little prolonged, in which, okay, I get it playing her, but I kind of forgot that I was also playing Ellie at one point. So with that imagery, with Joel's death, which Ellie witnessed herself, now kind of starts this spark of vengeance and revenge, not just for Ellie, but for Abby. So this entire game, the story is showing the efforts that Ellie was taking to ensure revenge against Abby. But at the same time, you're seeing the side of life and the walk of life of Abby in order to gain some type of perspective throughout this game. I understand the skepticism and I understand the criticism behind the story. I will get to that in the third act, but let's for the sake of this act, let's keep moving on with the story. So eventually we see, you know, Abby going through her vendetta phase, but then we also see Abby going through her phase in which she has her own problems, you know, her guy problems, her problems with, you know, being a part of this community, and really kind of showcasing a character arc for Abby as well. And throughout this game, which is bloody and dark and disturbingly violent, like you thought The Last of Us Part 1 was violent, this is violent. Killing of the clickers and the infected, but the killing of humans, it really is a very disturbing imagery to behold for this video game. So the story being, Ellie, after witnessing the gruesome death of Joel, decides upon herself to take revenge and set out to find Abby, which she last hears is in Seattle. So her, along with her now new love interest, Dina, we go to Seattle. We see the events showcasing in Seattle with Ellie finding out that Dina is pregnant and having to look after her and fend for her while they're in Seattle, as well as Abby with her group and her community being the leader in her status and her stature that she is, while also really seeing kind of the lightheartedness in her, if there is, and really seeing her side and her perspective and her ordeals, especially with her love interest and her, you know, other counterpart, Owen. So as all plays out, Ellie is able to kind of infiltrate and kill, actually, Abby's love interest, Owen. So you see that side. And then you've got Abby, who's gotten her own perilous adventure where she was abducted but also saved by these two new secondary characters, Yara and Lev. And you see that side kind of play out, and then you see kind of her humane side in which she saves Lev. And then it kind of comes to this final showdown where Abby and Ellie meet up at Ellie's hideout in Seattle. And you think this is where it's going to conclude, but it just ends up being this kind of big ruffle in which Abby almost kills Ellie, but lets her go. So fast forward maybe a few months, a year maybe, after the events of Seattle, and we see Abby living her life carefree, now with Dina and the baby. In, I believe they're back in Jackson, but despite this new life that she had, she's still traumatized by the death of Joel and this notion of unfinished business. So despite Dina's efforts, she goes back out, seeking revenge, trying to find Abby, who's seen somewhere in California. I forgot where in California. And then we get another story where we see Abby and Lev be abducted by this new community of people, and we see Ellie going over to California, trying to find Abby, trying to invoke her revenge. But after seeing kind of the conditioning that Abby was left in as she was also abducted, it's kind of bringing everything to kind of full circle. And then just as they were about to leave and escape the confines of this community, one last confrontation between Abby and Ellie, and it was just another scuffle. But this was an important scuffle in that Ellie, who had gone through this entire tenure trying to seek revenge and kill Abby, has the notion to let her go. Despite losing a finger or two, Ellie comes to her senses and realizes that this isn't the type of revenge to be taking place, and she lets Abby go. She lets Abby and Lev go. And then the final sequence of the story, we see Ellie return back to the house in Jackson, just to see it isolated with nobody home, seemingly Dina and the baby going away and away from her. But Ellie's stuff's still intact. And we see a last shot of the guitar that was left behind, which was also Joel's guitar, a symbolism of kind of like letting go or letting go of the past or whatnot. And we see Abby hiking her own trail and making her own path, which was a little bit of a hollow conclusion in my opinion. It wasn't as rambunctious or as open-ended or ambiguous as the first Last of Us. You know, that cliffhanger of an ending, really leaving speculation for what's going to happen for part 2. From the conclusion of this story on part 2, where does it go? It may seem a little hollow and it may seem a little underwhelming, but where do Ellie and Abby go? Guess we're gonna have to wait another 7 years to find that out. There's a lot to be discussed in this game that I can only go through so much, but if you want to talk about the stories or aspects of the stories that I didn't cover, please leave them in the comments. I know there's so much more tidbits and a lot more subjects to kind of examine and investigate that I didn't even get a chance to talk about. So feel free to add them on the comments, and I'll be sure to look at those. But in regards to the actual execution, yes, there's the divisive story, the secondary characters, the new characters that have been focused much more, as well as the current characters that were kind of slain in the first act of the video game. And then not to mention the beautifully crafted gameplay and graphics and overall animations and designs of this game. So much divisiveness, so much unevenness, but a lot to kind of digest. Now with that kind of concluded, but open to interpretation, let's go ahead and go to Act 3. Act 3, Response. The Last of Us Part 2, Take 1. Now, what could supersede the actual execution of this game? The response. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about the response of this game. Supposedly, the length of this game is about 24 to 26 hours of gameplay, and not even 24 hours into the release of the video game, there were already negative scores all throughout rating websites, left and right. Various video game community websites panned this game, giving it negative reviews all throughout. There can be a lot to pinpoint the reasoning for this that I'm not going to really kind of dive in myself, but I will point out and let you interpret. The leak story, I think, was a big contribution to the possible mass negative criticism of The Last of Us Part 2. I think a lot of fans were not happy about the fact that Joel was killed in the first act. The fact that this character, who we were waiting, in my case a few months, but in many other cases more than 6 years, the fact that in less than 6 hours you were able to kill him off already kind of felt like a gut punch. And it's really hard to recover from that when really the best part of the first game, the interaction between Joel and Ellie, and in particular Joel as a character, is just taken away from us. And so many loose ends, might I add. Eventually throughout the game you do see those loose ends kind of tied up in some way or some fashion, but still, knowing that Joel suffered an untimely and very grisly death is unfortunate, especially for everyone that's waited so long to not only get a chance to play this game, but experience the continuation of this lasting relationship between these two beloved characters. So I understand that gripe. I think a lot of people too may not have agreed with the perspective or the overall, I guess agenda. I guess that's a word that everyone likes to throw around. Agenda that this game is thrown around. Because it involves a main character that is lesbian, I think the aspect, whether fans want to admit it or not, the lesbian angle between Ellie and Dina might have made people feel a bit uncomfortable. But to those critics, should you really be surprised? I mean, it was teased already in the DLC pack of the first Last of Us with Ellie and her friend just before she meets Joel. There is a lot of reasonings to the overall panning of this game. Just like I mentioned those points, there are so many other factors too that I'm not gonna go into in particularly, but just overall brunt and scale of negative responses to a game that barely came out a day, that requires more than a day to play, was a little bit of a question mark. But to each their own, there could be some validity to some people's negativity, to some people's, criticisms towards the game, and I totally respect and understand those. But it does raise a little bit of an eyebrow as to those other critics that immediately gave it a negative review, because it's one of those things where the critics loved it, the fans hated it, and that ever-long balance of force between critics and fans alike. We see it in movies, we see it in television, and of course it spills in to the world of video game. I did mention, of course, the violent nature of this game and how really dark and violent this game gets. With the added improvement in gameplay, also showcases the more graphic imagery of the violent stuff that takes place in the game. But as far as making you uncomfortable and making you feel like you're immersed in this dark, gloomy, post-apocalyptic, deathly vibe and atmosphere. I think the job was well done in regards to the game getting that aspect through. I think the game still did a good enough job to make you feel uncomfortable in this post-apocalyptic and very, very dark world. As of this recording, I believe the game has sold over 4 million copies, both physically and digitally, since its release, making it to this date the fastest selling PlayStation 4 game in history. So critics love it, fans hated it. The polarizing agendas displayed in this video game, as well as the 4 million copies sold, making it the fastest selling game in the console's history. So a lot of big responses, both negative and positive, in regards to this game, and a lot to really digest. Once again, this game has a lot to really kind of drink in. It's violent. It's very, very unsettling. But I think it's the job of the developers to make you feel that way. But I can understand the gripes of others who disagree with either the perspective or the agendas or the overall treatment of certain characters. So with everything being said, development, execution, response, I will go ahead and come up with, I guess, another divisive and polarizing verdict. So here we go. My verdict for The Last of Us Part 2. Remember, this is in the perspective of a not so avid video gamer who happens to be a new fan to the world of The Last of Us. Will I say The Last of Us Part 2 is better than Part 1? No. But still, as a overall game, I will give credit where credit is due. The presentation of this game is phenomenal, beyond belief. The overall gameplay was improved and then some. The CGI, just the overall expansion of this world has been so deafening and so illustrious in its own self. The story is a little bit of a hiccup, I will admit. I think we kind of spent a bit too much time with Abby, to a point where when the showdowns went down between Abby and Ellie, it did make me feel a bit uncomfortable that Ellie was the antagonist and that I had to play as Abby fighting Ellie. I understand the gripes with the story. I understand the gripes with certain characters such as Joel being killed. I understand people really not being on board with Abby, with her perspective, her walks of life, and really kind of taking away the spotlight from Ellie at times, and really making Ellie kind of lose focus of the character that she previously was in the first game. I understand that. But I will raise a question, and I'll raise this question up for interpretation for anyone that either likes the game or doesn't like the game. Would you still feel the same way if in the first Last of Us game, we were introduced to Abby first instead of Ellie? That's just my thoughts of it. It's because perspective really plays a role in this. Yes, revenge was shoved down our throats, and I get it, and I really was fascinated by the whole aspect of revenge. The tie-ins to that Pearl Jam song and that Pearl Jam lyric, if I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself. Seeking vendetta and seeking revenge, you do lose yourself, and you lose yourself with also the people that you love and the people that you affect around you. With Owen being killed and Dina being pushed away from Ellie, you can see really kind of the ramifications of revenge. But I think perspective needs to be understood in regards to the story of this game. But let's see this from a different lens, from a different side. What if we had seen Abby's story first and not Ellie's story? Would you feel the same way? So in that reasoning, I do find this story, though hollow in its conclusion and bumpy along the way and too extensive on one end compared to the other, I still find the story very, very interesting and very eye-opening in regards to looking things from both lenses. So in that regards, and also with the gameplay and graphics and just the overall presentation, I will give The Last of Us Part 2 an 8.8 out of 10. And I already hear all the skeptics and all of the haters and all of the naysayers. Oh, that's too high of a score. Oh, you didn't even play the game. Oh, you're not a real fan. Shut the f up. I get it. But all that's gonna go in one ear, out the other, because this is my review. And this is the beautiful thing about it. I have a perspective on it. You have a perspective on it. And I would love to hear what your thoughts were. And maybe you might open my eyes into something that I didn't see when I initially played the game. But please feel free to put it on the comments. I really want to know what your thoughts are and your entire aspect and your entire mindset when it came to the overall envisioning of this video game. Were you impressed? Were you not impressed? Just let me know. And we can have full, healthy conversations without having to barge on one another and spew hateful tirades. We can have some meaningful, healthy, lengthy conversations, and we can learn something. You know why? Because that's perspective. You know why? Because that's perspective. Kind of like what you see in this video game, at least in my opinion. So that's my review for The Last of Us Part 2. I hope you guys enjoy this. I hope you found this interesting and allowed you the opportunity to really see things from different perspectives, different viewpoints, different walks of life. And if you have any type of rebuttal or any type of response, any type of comments, please feel free to showcase. I am open to any and all comments, whether you loved it, whether you hate it. I really want to know, please. Once again, if you haven't played The Last of Us Part 2, nor if you played The Last of Us Part 1, I urge you, pause this video, take some time to either start and or finish the video games, and then come back to this. If you haven't seen my review yet for The Last of Us Part 1, please, I urge you to look at the review. That's linked somewhere in this video or somewhere in the description below. You'll find it somewhere, I'll put it up. This was a lot of work to dive into both Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2, and I hope everyone comes out of this really having a new understanding or having a new kind of knowledge and insight to either the story or the development of this game, as well as The Last of Us overall. So thank you for tuning in. Hopefully I get to do more video games in the future, but until then, I'm gonna go back to my regularly scheduled program with movies next week. That, my friends, is a wrap.